Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strangeness of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman-Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unseen Paranormal. Today we have a great guest for you, Leanna Renee Hieber, and she is the co-author of the new book, A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of American Ghosts, which we'll be discussing today. Leanna Renee Hieber is an actress, playwright, ghost tour guide, and the award-winning best-selling author of over 14 gothic, gas lamp, fantasy, supernatural suspense, and nonfiction books for adults and teens. Leanna's books can be found on Kindle, Amazon, her website, LeannaReneeHieber.com, and anywhere fine books are sold. Hey, Leanna, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, and first off, I just want to say we're going to have your co-author of the book, Andrea Janes, on, but unfortunately she's under the weather.
Correct. Yes, but she sends her regards and happy haunting.
Yeah, I'll have to have her on a later date and talk about the book and talk about her awesome tours in New York. So how did you get into, because I know you do a lot of young adult fiction and things like that, and this is kind of your first foray into nonfiction. But how did you get into writing like supernatural suspense and get into the paranormal?
It's been with me since I was a child. My earliest memories are of telling ghost stories to my friends and my Girl Scout troop and just making up stories on the fly and finding a great rush of power and excitement in doing so and liking to like gently scare my friends. And so I think like I was always a spooky kid. I was always interested in reading ghost stories. I had this tattered paperback cover of this book called Haunted Houses, and it was just a little chapter book with 13 ghost stories in it. And I just imprinted on that book. I was handed a volume of Edgar Allan Poe by one of my teachers, and I was just really drawn to sort of these darker themes, but in a way of like finding a brighter side on the way through them. And ghost stories for me were very interesting. I had paranormal experiences that happened to me as a kid, but they weren't necessarily scary. They were more like having the sense of my loved ones being present. And so I definitely started to think about ghost stories, at least the things I had experiences with, as spirits that still wanted to tell us something as the living. My earliest stories kind of deal with some of these themes of like sort of an ongoing familial saga in ways with the living and the spirit world, continuing to have a conversation. I went into theater as my first and foremost career because I loved performing. And so that being a ghost tour guide in New York City definitely comes from that theater background. But I was always writing kind of in the background. I was doing performative pieces. I was writing plays. I was doing things with professional theater that was based on some of my writing. And then I got all the way to a Broadway callback in New York City, and all I could think about was a novel that I'd been working on for the past 9 years, 10 years in the background of trying to be a professional actress. So I realized at that moment when I was at this Broadway callback, I needed to stop and rethink my life and go pursue this other passion. And so I networked within different publishing circles in New York City, and I started going to conferences, and I started taking classes on specifically fiction writing because I'd been doing I'd been doing dramatic fiction. Writing a play is very different than writing a book. And so I had all these ideas, and finally, it came to fruition, but after a very long process of trying to be both an actor and a writer at the same time. But I got my first book deal in 2009, and then I've been publishing at least one, if not two novels every year since then. So we're up to, I'll have my 15th fiction book coming out this fall. So the nonfiction came directly out of being a ghost tour guide with Andrea's company, Burrows of the Dead. I was her first hire as an employee, not herself. So she founded Burrows of the Dead, a New York City-based tour company that's focused on history as well as macabre and spooky tales of New York City. So she's very interested in real history and then how these urban legends and myths and ghost stories intersect with history. And her and I very much had a similar idea about how we should tell ghost stories, which is first and foremost respect for the dead.
Right.
Above all, we came together on that. And as being her first employee, we talked a lot about that kind of vision for the company as I was, sort of her first extension beyond herself. So when an editor at a publishing house who I'd worked with, took one of my tours, was like, you really should do a ghost story book because you've got an angle and you've got a voice for this type of thing. So, there was definitely an angle and an opinion that both Andrea and I bring to our tours and a way in. And we're interested specifically in telling women's stories. And often the stuff that doesn't get lifted up, often some of the stories of more of the unnamed dead and the ghost of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, which we start the book with, was one of our first, real passion projects, coming together, wanting to write the story about those, how that ghost story is a cautionary tale for our modern labor movement, making sure that we don't have any of our modern safety protections in our workplaces taken away. So it's like ghost stories that can serve a modern day lesson. We are very interested in those things. So between an editor saying, hey, you should write a ghost book, me knowing I didn't want to do that without Andrea's feedback. So I just very quickly brought her into the mix. I said, I definitely want, you on board as a co-author with this. And I really felt like a lot of my sense of how I would be telling ghost stories was due to working with her company. And so really this became kind of a Bros of the Dead project between the two of us. And I knew I could trust her to tell a good ghost story because she's an excellent tour guide and a great writer. And she's also a fiction writer. So we both had this interesting intersection of, okay, where does fact become fiction? And how can we separate those two if we're actually talking about a historic person and an actual life? Here are these reported ghost stories. How do we fact check them? You can't really. So
Right.
we're interested in asking the questions of, okay, here are the reports through the years. Here are some of the things we can debunk outright. Here are the things that don't add up that we can't debunk. Here are our personal experiences in the haunted houses. And we went to as many places as we physically could. I took a special trip out to the Winchester Mystery House just to write that chapter. So a long answer to your question. It was a long process of pretty much a lifetime of our careers leading up to this book. And I know I couldn't have done it any sooner because I needed to spend a lot of time just with my feet on the ground in New York City and in other haunted places around the nation, thinking about the intersection of history, women, and ghosts.
Yeah, and like you said, we're some of our experiences, and so jumping into something like that too soon, maybe it wouldn't come out the way that you wanted it to.
Exactly. I needed to have a real sense of what I had to say. I needed a certain amount of maturity. I needed a certain amount of craft experience through fiction that helped me hone what would make a good ghost story on paper and the structure of how to tell it, which is informed by storytelling and in a fictional sense, and then just making sure that we're telling the history as an interesting story. Because when we were approached by the editor that we're working with, it was very clear that narrative nonfiction was our genre. And in narrative nonfiction, you got to focus on the narrative. It has to be engaging, and it cannot be a dry academic text. It's very well researched what we've done. There's an enormous bibliography, so we've definitely done our homework. But we're still ultimately trying to tell a story that gets you engaged and hopefully puts you in the place of these historic settings, leads you through these spaces, and introduces you to characters we hope you learn something about as you go.
Yeah, and I love your approach to the book with the history kind of up front and foremost, and then kind of telling the ghost story and the legend and the folklore that comes along with that. That's kind of my favorite type of ghost stories and books on the subject, because I think it's very important. I've been an investigator for many years, and I think it's very important to approach any place knowing the history. And like you were saying, I think it also gives you an appreciation and respect for those people that they actually lived. And this is not just a story. Like these, even though the story may be made up and parts of it may be fiction because of, it's become legend over the years, these are still real people that lived, that part of the story is about.
Exactly. That's definitely our aim, is to make sure that we give some of these women back some of the narrative that ran away from them in many ways. I mean, and Sarah Winchester is the prime example of that, and probably the most famous example of that. She is a character who people know, but we really only know the fiction about her broadly in terms of cultural experience. Helen Mirren did a wonderful job playing Sarah Winchester in the movie Winchester, but it's a horror movie and it's completely made up. The only thing that's true about that is that she was a nice lady, which Helen Mirren portrays very well. She was very intelligent, also, which is portrayed correctly. She always dressed in Victorian mourning. Yes, that is true. And they filmed some of it at the Winchester Mystery House, this labyrinthine mansion that Sarah Winchester built starting in the late 19th and early 20th century and kept building and building and building. And people ascribed all these weird reasons and all these fabricated reasons as to why she was doing what she was doing. And at the end of the day, there's a lot to debunk there. And I got very protective of Sarah as I was writing this chapter, and so do many of the tour guides who lead tours through that mansion. And I had the honor of getting a private sneak peek into some of the spaces that weren't available publicly via the house historian, Janin Boehm. She's the first house historian they've ever had, and she hasn't had that job very long. So it's interesting to me that the Winchester Mystery House, this great historic mansion, has only recently had a house historian who is trying to sort of gently separate fact from fiction, because she's got a tricky job, because people come here for these legends of this haunted lady kept building onto her house because she was haunted by the ghosts of those killed with a Winchester rifle. That's the popular myth. So that's not remotely in any of the actual history involving Sarah. That was ascribed to her during her lifetime, before she even died. So we're interested in this whole story, chapter by chapter, section by section, in trying to say, okay, so here is how some of these legends would have come to be. And let's unpack this a little bit. Let's unpack the fact that a nation was offshoring its own guilt about guns onto this lady. There was no indication she felt one way or another about the Winchester money that she inherited, other than she gave a lot of it away to charity, like millions of dollars in those days' money, let alone now. So yeah, it's just, she's one example of many ladies that we try to sort of give back some of their story to, if at all possible, as best we know how, because not everything is written down.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't know she actually had like beach houses, and like she didn't just roam the halls of this weird mansion, brooding.
Exactly. Well, and it's funny because like some of the stuff you can understand how it would start, though, because she did have insomnia.
Yeah.
And people were always curious about her, and she never entertained. So people didn't get to go into this house and really get to know her. She was very shy. She was very retiring. She didn't talk about what she was doing. So people just gossiped, especially about a really wealthy lady who the rest of like upper crust society was offended that she didn't invite over for dinner parties. And so you can imagine that, someone's looking up at this mysterious place and sees a lady wandering around in the middle of the night because she's got insomnia. And people started ascribing these weird things to it when it's actually a much more mundane answer. But like the concept that she was always building around the clock, that she was constantly building on that house, that came from just the concept that she was always building. And that wasn't meant to be taken literally. It's like somebody at one point said, oh, she's always doing a building project. And people are saying, oh, this is always happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No, she let her crew break and have meals, and she paid them twice what any other employer paid. So they loved her and stayed on willingly and lovingly for the rest of her life. So she's a fascinating layer of so many onion layers to this lady and to her house, because when you go from one part of it, you go into another. So she is much like her house in some ways, a mystery.
Yeah, and kind of going along with that also is like Lizzie Borden. Everybody knows the famous story of Lizzie Borden. She supposedly killed her parents, even though she was acquitted. But that was just one part of her life. She lived this longer life and had much more things go on than just that. And, she's relegated to history to just the story of her parents being murdered.
Right, exactly. And wrote a brilliant chapter about Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden's been a fascination of hers for a long time. How the book breaks down is that each of us have our own chapters, except for some that we've co-written out of our own personal experiences. We'll share them together in some co-written chapters, but ones that were particular passion projects, like, there was no question I was going to do the Sarah Winchester chapter. There's no question she was going to do the Lizzie Borden chapter. Just so like sort of our pet interests influenced which chapters we did. And she wrote this brilliant chapter that goes through all of what evidence there is. And even through this, she still cannot come to a conclusion herself about what really happened. And there really is only Lizzie knows what happened that day. And there's a possibility that she even doesn't quite remember due to a mental state or some other thing that we will never know of what actually happened. There's stuff in that case that's still classified. So maybe we'll know someday. But in the meantime, we don't know. And so I think there's a lot with this book that we wrestle with the unanswered questions, and we grapple with that along with the reader, and hope that you will grapple with us and make some of your own conclusions. We try not to tell people what to think. We just try to express the facts. We share our opinions. We have passionate opinions, and we share them. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we're not saying, well, this is the only way to think about this.
Right. And one of the things that, and this comes across in the book as well, one of the things I've always noticed in a lot of legends and ghost stories, and these kind of go around the world in different places. You have things like the Lady in White, which is a very common apparition scene, and then you have like the bride to be, who's always haunting a place for whatever reason. She was going to get married. She either committed suicide, or something happened to her, or happened to her fiance, and she was never the bride, and so now she's haunting these places. And I find that interesting because you never hear stories like that of men throughout the legends and folklore. It's always women, and that's what I love, that you kind of dive into that psychology in the book. How kind of this is the reason for that is kind of the same as the reason for women being marginalized in our society.
Yeah, I mean, we break the book down into tropes, and so it's broken down into sections of maidens and wives and mothers and quote unquote witches and quote unquote mad women and fallen women, bad girls, these various different sort of tropes and placeholders that women will sometimes be shunted into. And we just talk about that. We unpack a bit about that. There's an introduction that we do to each section where we talk about, okay, let's think about what is the woman in white standing for. And just in a very real historical record sense, women's lives were not as detailed or documented often as men's lives were. So a lot of times, you can look at property records and you can find the men of the family who held the property records. There's literally just not always, because of 19th century property law not including women until really the late 19th century, not fully. The first women's property laws were being brought forth in like the 1850s and 60s in England and America, and then of course other that's only for white women. So talking about other additional marginalization, it's even harder to trace the actual lives of some folks. So there's a historical reason why there's a whole lot of women as stand-ins rather than necessarily named beings, but also then too, just the concept of stereotype and trope means there are these placeholders that really serve as sort of what society would expect. The grieving bride waiting for her happiness, and the happiness is tied to this matrimonial thing, or the wailing mother who has lost a child. And so the identity as bride, or the identity as a mother above her identity herself, these are things that we're examining, and how does that factor into ongoing ghost lore, which you're exactly right, is something that's quite universal. Those tropes and those stereotypes, those are going to change culturally, and they change regionally too across the United States. And they're definitely going to have different factors when you take that internationally. But there is something very resonant to that across the world.
Yeah, and I find it fascinating that if you pay attention to even like paranormal shows, women kind of take a backseat on the paranormal shows. They're always the co-host, never the host. And so even up until today, we're kind of marginalizing women in the paranormal, which I find ridiculous. As a gay man, I feel like, gays are also marginalized kind of in the paranormal. There's never been like a gay-led paranormal show either. And,
right.
Yeah.
And there should be.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And that is the thing. I mean, because along with this is that there's also these gender roles and heteronormativity that is put onto all this stuff too. There's so many possibilities with ghosts. It's like ghosts could be, you don't necessarily know, a ghost could be presenting as a ghost in a way that they couldn't present in a gender way as a living person, maybe. Right. So there's possibilities, there's ways in which the spectral world can break down in some ways some of the boundaries that history has put people through, of no matter how you break down those marginalizations. And I think it's unfortunate that some of the very mainstream ghost shows kind of double down on the gender roles, on the heteronormativity, on the just sort of a bit of a ghost bro kind of mentality. And Katrina Weidman talks about that. So she's one of the few women who is in the paranormal TV show Space, and I met her and chatted with her about her experiences, and she talks about that in our introduction, about carving that space out and holding that space, because women have always been involved in the paranormal. Women have always been telling ghost stories, and women have always been in the ghost seeking spaces. Catherine Crowe was the first ghost hunter, centuries before we're talking here. So there's definitely a lot of history that has involved women in the paranormal, but women being able to be leaders in the paranormal is something that, while the spiritualist movement really allowed women to shine, in our current modern incarnation, women are writing, definitely, but not necessarily in that visible lead in terms of, at least with the ghost shows. We do talk about, women being leaders in the spiritualist movement of the 19th century, coming to the forefront and being able to use the idea of speaking with the dead as a bit of a platform for their social issues. And really, the history of women's rights is entwined with the spiritualist movement, really, too. That's a whole nother topic for another day. But we go into that some in our work. But I definitely, one of the things that Katrina Wiseman talked about in her introduction section is her hope that the paranormal shows and the industry surrounding all of this continues to diversify and open up for any marginalized group.
Yeah, I've had her on the show here, and she's amazing. She's my favorite on TV. And,
oh my gosh, she really is.
Yeah, and also she's one of the only ones on TV that I actually trust. That is kind of it's not just entertainment to her. She's actually serious about what she's doing. And I think for her, being a strong female, she probably threatens a lot of the males in the industry.
She's not had an easy road.
Yeah, paranormal TV is kind of a small world, and so for her to have fought her way, just from starting this in college and doing what she does now is just amazing.
It's so great, and she's such a nice person, and it's just so wonderful to be able to lift her up. The minute that this book was announced, and I had worked with her at just doing a media tour in New York, and just was so impressed by her just as a person, let alone her talents. And I knew I had to see if she would be able to give us a few moments of her time to get her thoughts down on paper. And so I was so glad to be able to lead the book with some of her thoughts, because she really is holding space and doing so very graciously. And I really think that can set a lovely example in terms of just confidently holding space. And from her perspective, she wants that to continue to widen to any other folks from any kind of background. She wants everybody to feel welcome in the paranormal as much as anyone's comfortable. And I want that too. That's definitely something that's been a part of my entire, fiction career. My books are very diverse, with very diverse casts of all kinds of different, orientations and gender identities and racial backgrounds and faith backgrounds and things like that. I'm writing about metropolises, I'm writing about cities where there's all these wonderful people. And I'm writing historical fantasy. Well, guess what? Diversity was always a part of the cities, of our nation's cities or the other places I'm writing about. And I think, if you don't reflect that, then you're really missing out on a much richer world. And so I also think in the paranormal, we want to make sure that continues to be a space that is welcoming.
Yeah, and like we were talking about at the beginning of the show, we're all some of our experiences. And so coming from different diverse backgrounds, we can all bring something different to the paranormal, and to even going out and investigating. And if you want to, provide evidence and that's what you want to do, then maybe you have a unique take because of who you are and because of your background, right, and because you're not some heteronormative masculine guy like you see on TV. I think I've seen it in practice, going out and investigating for myself. I'm a big guy. I kind of have a dominant personality. And even though I go in with respect to investigating, and that's how I approach the paranormal, sometimes I think, it's a turnoff for ghosts to talk to me. And so I think it's great to have women there as well. I think even like maybe kid spirits, or, but also going back in history when women were kind of silenced. I think maybe they're still living in those times. And so maybe they don't want to talk to a man.
It's funny that you mentioned that. There's an exact story in the book in my chapter about Eliza Jamel, who's the woman who kept the Morris Jamel Mansion in her name. It's Manhattan's oldest house. It's a colonial mansion on Washington Heights in uptown Manhattan. And they do paranormal investigations in there regularly. And so I went as a part of an overnight, and you can stay overnight in the house, and it generates income for the Historic House Museum. And I love the fact that, like, regardless of if you see or if you have any paranormal experience, you're helping the house stay solvent as a museum, which is something I'm, really passionate about. But we had a pretty incredible encounter in that there was a group of men and women who were sitting around in a circle in Eliza's bedroom. She's a Victorian lady. Mixed company, would never have been in her bedroom. And so the investigator had set down a flashlight where the top had been unscrewed so that just a little bit of the metal could just barely be touching against its receptor. And so he said to the room, explained the rules of, like, we're going to ask you questions. We're hoping to talk to the lady of the house, and respond if you can with a 2 blinks for yes and a blink for no. And there was nothing until the authors that I was with, we said to the room, we're like, this is not a comfortable situation for Eliza. She would not actually want to just have strangers in her bedroom, let alone men in her bedroom that are not her husband. So, and as we said this, the flashlight blinked twice for yes. Like, as we were saying, hey, look, let's let the lady of the house have privacy in the way that she's accustomed. And so the men, bless them, they were like, all right, nope, okay, that's clear. They left. And then through a blinking flashlight for the next half an hour, we had a lovely little yes or no blinking conversation with Eliza Jamel, the lady of the house, and whether or not she liked company. And she did, but with the qualifier of it had to be respectful. So we could, it was just this fascinating thing. And we all examined the flashlight. We're like, is this a trick flashlight? Is this no, it just was a flashlight. And Eliza does have a history in that house of flickering the lights and being able to manipulate electricity. So I don't know, like I had never experienced something that directly call and response kind of based. It was something absolutely unreal. And if I hadn't been with a bunch of my friends who corroborated that they were seeing what I was seeing, I wouldn't have believed it. I mean, I'm a skeptic first and a believer second. I am a believer, but it's like, I go in without an expectation. But that is exactly what you're talking about in terms of you have to kind of meet the ghosts where they are in their lives. And that would certainly be the case for anyone else who either was silenced or wasn't able to live freely as themselves. They'd be very hesitant talking about it.
Yeah. And that's across a lot of different things, not just women, but even maybe enslaved people. I'm a white guy, and so they wouldn't have, why would they talk to me? Because back in their day,
right.
Yeah, they were oppressed by white men. So yeah, and so I think it's very important to have a diversity across the paranormal, and I think diversity in general, it's just a great thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, especially in the paranormal and being knee deep in this, I've been more conscious about it lately. I actually had a listener who messaged me and kind of brought it to my attention that unconsciously to me, I have a really good mix of men and women on my show here. And I've got 100 episodes and it's a really good mix. And this lady brought to my attention that a lot of the other paranormal shows that are hosted by men, they have nothing but men on. And I never thought about that until I started paying attention. And I'm not saying that to like toot my own horn. It's just something that I just did because I want to talk to everybody because I think everybody's fascinating.
Right.
But I started listening to some of these bigger podcasts who've been around for a long time and get kind of the most downloads. And it's just man after man after man after man as a guest.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I never noticed that before, but I'm glad she brought it to my attention.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm so glad for it too. And like, believe me, we notice these things and are grateful for the platforms. I mean, we all think about it, like all of us need allies. Everybody needs allies. Everybody needs to feel like we can build a sense of community. And that community really cannot be only one type of person.
Right.
It's just really not how society can work well. So I feel like, and I do think we all do need to be conscious of it, and not in a tooting our own horn way, but just making sure that we continue to operate on that instinct of inclusion, because then we'll make sure that we can maybe then have a conversation with somebody that changes their mind about how how they're operating and what types of media they're consuming to make sure that they're also, reading diversely. As a writer, you need to understand other people's viewpoints. You're writing characters who are not yourself, so I feel like that, especially in every kind of media industry, we need to be consuming things on a very broad range of perspectives, because that's the only way we're gonna learn. And right now our world is suffering from a critical lack of empathy, and we really need more of that in the world. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you're aware of that, and I feel like you can continue, you can be changing minds in that, in it, just in a gentle, person by person, case by case way of being like, hey, how can we continue to open up our worldview?
Yeah. Yeah. And I always, I knew when I started this show that I wanted to be very authentic to myself and be very open about, I'm a gay man. I have a husband. We've been together
Hmm.
17 years, and I'm,
Congratulations.
thank you. And I'm very open about that because I want, okay, if there's other gay people out there who listen to my show, not for me as an advertising thing, but just to say, oh, there are gay people in the paranormal.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. And just because they hear my show and I'm open and honest about it, and open and honest on social media about it, and not a kind of in your face way, but just that this is who I am. And so hopefully
Right.
that helps other people to recognize there is a space for gays and lesbians and transgender people in the paranormal, and people like us definitely welcome them into the space.
Absolutely. It's so true. It's so critical. And that, just feeling like there are, representation is so important. And it's just, especially right now when marginalized communities across all kinds of different backgrounds are under increasing attack by virulent, hateful language and legislation even.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's all the more important for that, just to be confident in one's identity. I mean, the phrase "existence is resistance" is a really good phrase, and I think that in some ways that goes back to the ghosts too. Sometimes these ghosts are here because they too have something to say, and they've got unfinished business, and they don't want to be forgotten either, because of whatever thing happened against them that was a tragedy, and as a reminder. And we have to be careful that we're not, exploiting that necessarily or fetishizing that.
Right.
We have to be very careful, like going into, and we talk a lot about that in the book, about making sure that if we're in an industry, that the way in which we monetize this we have to be doing it very delicately and very carefully, as, especially for me, thinking about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where all of these people died because of unsafe working conditions. I'm very passionate about the labor movement, and the labor movement really, really kicked off because of the tragedy of 146 people dying in this factory fire. 123 of them were women as young as 14 years old. And the horror of it is so raw and real. So I make sure that when I'm telling any truly horrific details about this, I'm doing it to make a point, not because I want to be salacious about it,
Right.
but I'm making a point of, like, the reporters at the time reported every grisly detail because they were trying to change public opinion, saying, no, really, these people have been going on labor strikes, and these people have been marching for safer working conditions for literally years now. And this is what happens when you don't pay attention. So, but you have to make sure that the truth of it is not sensationalized, even though the horror of it is truly sensationally awful. So it's just, this is something that's like, I don't necessarily have an answer for the exact right balance. We tried to strike it as best as we could in this, and for some people it might not read that we've struck the right balance in that, and we've done the best we can. I mean, that's really all we can say as imperfect beings going through all of this journey of life, is just do the best we can and try to listen to others as we go.
Yeah, I think y'all struck a perfect balance. I think it's a great balance of telling the history and the stories of these women, also getting to the psychology and relating it to what we're going through now, like we've been talking about.
Absolutely. And when we talk about, gender constructs within the book, we also talk about how restrictions on any kind of gender is difficult for everybody. It's like the concept of standards of beauty for women is really difficult for folks who are non-binary or trans women, and how all of these things factor in depending on the intersectionality of that. And, so we're really we're writing from the perspective of women as women, but at the same time, very aware that like gender roles for everyone in society, when they have no flexibility, that is difficult for everyone involved in society. When they feel like when individuality becomes completely secondary to some sort of societal standard that's not necessarily applicable to everybody. So, in some ways, the paranormal found ways around that. In some ways, different communities that were trying to find a new way about things, like the Shaker community, which was an offshoot of the Quaker community, which were Protestant Christians, that the name Shakers and Quakers came from their sort of religious ecstasies. They would be trembling. And the woman who founded the Shakers was a lady who believed that everyone should kind of be celibate and just live communally and just devote themselves to a higher power. And so for people who didn't want necessarily the prescribed way of nuclear family stuff, this was a way to live differently. And, so I think we're interested in ways in which these kinds of stories help to open up the world now and also open up the possibilities of the past and realize that people have been always trying to find their way amidst all of this.
Yeah, and I've seen several other books here lately that have come out. You got the Feminine Macabre, which is awesome also.
Yeah.
But kind of this push of women in the paranormal, and I think it's awesome. I think it's great.
Well, I'm thrilled. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be in this mix right now. And Amanda Woomer's Feminine Macabre series of journals is fantastic. I'm very honored that I'm in the 4th volume, and I got to write about a woman who I didn't get to put in the Haunted History of Invisible Women. So it was like an additional extra chapter that I got to include in the Feminine Macabre Volume 4. And yeah, Amanda Woomer is pushing very strongly and confidently about the same things we're talking about here, for inclusion and making space and making sure that people feel welcome. So I highly recommend that folks follow her. Spook Eats is her website. So, and she's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm gonna have her on the show here soon, and
oh, good. Well, give her my regards that we have proclaimed her awesomeness.
Yeah.
for the future episode.
Yeah, another contributor to the Feminine Macabre that I'm a huge fan of is Michelle Belanger.
Oh yeah. Completely, absolutely. What a powerhouse of a person.
Oh yeah, and if I believe in any psychics out there, it's definitely her. Any mediums, not psychics, but mediums, it's definitely her. And I respect everything that she's doing, and also putting herself out there as, this is who I am, unapologetically. You don't like it, I don't care. I just love that.
Absolutely. And also too, just all of the stuff that they're doing in terms of working on legislation. They just helped get a bit of understanding and education happening in Ohio by getting their birth certificate as an intersex person changed on the birth certificate in Ohio, and educated the court officers throughout that process, and found it to be a very positive and affirming thing, because there's just a lot of misinformation in terms of what intersex individuals have to deal with in life. And so there's just absolute respect for everything that Michelle has done throughout a very storied career, and that's only going to continue. And I've been very, very blessed to be paneling with Michelle and being able, we've done some Dragon Con panels together, and just a constant delight, and definitely a presence and a force in the industry, and has been holding space also for different identities as well. And that's such an important thing.
Yeah, Michelle was amazing. I had Michelle on the show as well, and I would love to have Michelle back on the show to chat some more. Also an amazing author.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing too. It's like we're all kind of called to be personalities in addition to writing too. And this as a podcast host, it's like you have to have a personality to be able to do what it is that we do,
right,
to lead tours, to go in, to be a host like you're doing, to be, to have the kinds of careers of any of the people that we're talking about. And that can be really exhausting. But at the same time, I think it's important that people are authentically themselves, because I think if you're not, you'll burn out very quickly. And I think that's why, I wanted to make sure that I was well into my 40s before I started writing this book, because I needed to be adult enough to really know myself and be confident enough that that I could hold that ground, as so many of these people I respect have been doing.
Yeah. Well, I love what y'all doing. I love the book. We're pre-recording this before the book comes out, but I got an advance copy thanks to you and your publisher. And it comes out September 27th. Everybody go check out A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of American Ghost. And it is co-authored by Andrea Janes. She has some awesome books out there as well, and hopefully I can get her on the show here soon. But Leanna, what do you have coming up besides the book that people can go check you out, see at your conventions or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I've got a bunch of things going on this fall. If you like the sound of my voice, you can check out all of the audiobooks that I have narrated on a website called Scribd. So that's CRIBD.com. And I do a bunch of historical fantasy novellas. So you can look up Leanna Renee Hieber, Hieber, and you'll pull up my books and you can hear me read them. I have a great deal of fun with that. Get to bring my theater background back into play with that. And so I just released a trilogy of gas lamp fantasy novellas, so historical fantasy, where a ghost and an exorcist fall in love, and it's very cute. And so that's the Spirit Suitor Chronicles has just come out, and I've got a new book, my first Gothic romance that's set in a contemporary setting. So all of my stuff in my fiction has been historical, but I have a contemporary set book coming out on October 11th with Castlebridge Media, and it's called Ghosts of the Forbidden. And it is an homage to Dark Shadows and the 70s era pulp Gothic. And it's about reincarnate Victorian lost lovers. So, of course, I have to get my little 19th century Victorian ghosts in there somehow, even in the contemporary setting. So that's coming up. And then I'll be on tour with Haunted History of Invisible Women for well into November and possibly December. So I'll be bouncing all around the country. So I do have on my social media, both on my Instagram and on my Twitter, and I'll be posting on Facebook as well, my tour schedule about where we'll be. We will have in-person events as well as online events. So there's a chance for everybody to get a chance to see us one way or another.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate your questions and your time and your energy.
Yeah, no problem. It was my pleasure. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there. Have a good day. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. The Unseen Paranormal Podcast is proud to be the ambassador for paranormal for Verbal.com. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening.